There we go. Got my audio coming through. Okay, we're good. All right, everybody. Welcome back to another reading hour. This will be reading hour for September 16th, 2025. All right, so picking back up on the Gladio book. We last left off on the section called The Gold Bars. In 1987, Licio Gelli turned himself over to Swiss authorities in South America, claiming that he was at the, quote, end of his tether and suffering from heart problems. He surrendered only after negotiating the terms of his return to Italy. He would be charged only with financial offenses. After serving less than 2 months behind bars, Gelli complained of deteriorating health and was released on parole. In 1992, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his involvement in the Ambrosiano affair. The sentence was reduced to 12 years upon appeal. For the next 6 years, Gelli remained under house arrest, detenzione domiciliare, at his luxurious villa in Tuscany. In 1998, when the police came to transport him to a public facility, Gelli disappeared again. In the villa, police discovered 363 pounds of gold bars buried in patio flower pots among his geraniums and begonias. Fucking hilarious. The Grand Master of P2 had stolen the gold from the Yugoslavian government while operating the rat lines for the Nazis. Again, it's how they sheltered the Nazis from accountability from any kind of like human rights trials or anything like that. Got them to South America or other countries. It's coming out now. I mean, I'm sure it's been common knowledge for a while, but I'm just recently finding out as of last week from a TikTok or a Reels, ironically, that many of them actually came to America. A lot of the Nazis were sheltered in the U.S., and then they, it was like, just like an intentional propaganda effort to blame Argentina for having sheltered all of them, or like other South American countries. But anyway, this might be from somebody who has an interest in defending Argentina. I don't know. The New Order is the next section here. In the reorganization of the Vatican finances under Opus Dei that got underway in 1989, a new 5-member supervisory board of, quote, lay experts was set up at the IOR. Its president was Angelo Caloia, head of the Medio Credito Lombardo Bank. The vice president was Philip de Weck. The other three were Dr. Jose Sanchez Asian, former chairman of Banco Bilbao, Thomas Pitzker, a director of the Deutsche Bank, and Thomas Macios, an American businessman. Or Macios, I don't know how you'd say that. Maciose. Anyway, it's a name. Who cares? The new managing director of the IOR was Giovanni Bodio, also from Medio Credito Lombardo. Caloio and Bodio were associated with Giuseppe Garofano, the one-time chairman of Monte de Son and president of Ferruzzi Finanziaria SPA, Italy's second largest industrial firm. Garofano, an Opus Dei supernumerary, served with Caloia on the Vatican's Ethics and Finance Committee until 1993, when he was arrested in connection with a $94 million political kickback scheme. Known as Clean Hands, the scheme involved the kickback of millions. They left out the of millions flowing through the quote Saint Serafino Foundation, an account Garofano set up at the IOR. Jose Sanchez Asian was a disciple of Bishop Alvaro del Portillo, who served as the general president of Opus Dei. Although Thomas Macios may not have been a member of Opus Dei, he shared its reactionary ideology. Remember, Opus Dei we had mentioned before was like this secret society of like dudes who would whip themselves and conform to all these like ridiculous kind of monastic practices, but they're all very far right. And I think they all took part in like some kind of violence, maybe even assassinations. They definitely worked together to like suppress the left in every way they could, violently if necessary. So let's see. So Macios was a Knight of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, along with Secretary of State Haig, CIA Director Casey, Treasury Secretary William Simon, Licio Gelli, former CIA Director John McCone, Prescott Bush Jr., brother of George H.W. Bush, President Reagan's National Security Advisor William P. Clark, Deputy CIA Director General Vernon A. Walters, and Count Alexander de Maurentius, the founder of the Safari Club. Yeah, wild shit. Okay. So it's not like it's just some kind of inconsequential group of these like Opus Dei or Military Order of Malta, SMOM, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. These are like obviously very high level influential people. Thomas Pitzker was a last-minute replacement for Herman Abs, the head of the Deutsche Bank and Pitzker's boss. Abs had been, it's just funny, his last name is Abs. Abs had been forced to resign from the committee due to the outcry from the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles about his role as, quote, Hitler's banker and a director of IG Farben, which ran its own slave labor camp at Auschwitz. Wow. Yeah, I mean, how are you going to have that guy just like walking around? Sorry, have a cold. Let's see. After the war, Abs was placed in charge of allocating funds from the Marshall Plan to German industry. This position made him a pivotal figure in the establishment of Gladio. Abs, like Maciois, was a knight of the SMOM. The finances of Holy Mother Church were now in the hands of a secret Catholic society that remained in the service of the CIA and a clandestine group of global economists. Man, if that doesn't sound like some Alex Jones shit, but like, you know, as in like who controls Alex Jones, but like what he would be talking about if he actually wanted to talk about the secret cabal of people who control the world. Chapter 21, Death and Reign. The investigation could identify people involved in Gladio back to 1972. Some of them had died, but some were alive. I discovered everyone who was responsible for the Petiano massacre in 1972. 3 terrorists, a gendarmerie general, a colonel, a marshal, intelligence and police chiefs, and members of the judiciary. All of them were found guilty and punished. However, the court did not put the organization itself on trial, although it agreed that Gladio had been involved. In the end, only those who were involved in the acts were punished, but not the organization. Moreover, we could identify only 622 quote gladiators, but the real number is much higher. The rest went into hiding. Judge Felice Casson, member of the Gladio Commission, today's Zaman, 2008. Okay, so that must be where that quote is from. As long as the U.S. public remains ignorant of this dark chapter in U.S. foreign relations, the agencies responsible for it will face little pressure to correct their ways. The end of the Cold War brought wholesale changes in other nations, but it changed little in Washington. In an ironic twist, confessed CIA mole Aldrich Ames has raised the basic question of whether the U.S. needs, quote, tens of thousands of agents working around the world, primarily in and against friendly countries. The U.S., he adds, still awaits a real national debate on the means and ends and costs of our national security policies. Yeah, I mean, when I had been doing podcast episodes with Jared and Joseph, like we were getting into that, I believe it's Project Censored or Project Uncensored. It's one of those two. And they've been keeping this archive for decades now. And if you just go back and read some of the ones from like the 80s or 90s, they are talking about the construction of the military industrial complex. Like they're talking about the construction of the deep state and how it's getting publicly admitted to in like headlines back then, but they're always like on page 6. They're not really talked about in like mainstream news. Even though they are published there, it's always like a byline or something. So this project literally just keeps track of news articles in mainstream media admitting to how the U.S. is constructing all these same kind of organizations that are never held accountable for all like the mass terrorism and genocides that they conduct. Let alone, again, the cost of that to all the Americans. So Arthur Rouse, Gladio, The Secret U.S. War to Subvert Italian Democracy, The Architecture of Modern Political Power, 1996. I guess that's another long quote from the source of that long quote. At the time of Sindona's strange death, the CIA's main concern was no longer left-wing political activity in Italy and Western Europe, but rather the situation in Afghanistan. The Great Jihad grew in scope and strength, threatening to sap the USSR of its strength and resolve. The inhabitants of the 5 republics of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, who shared a common Turkish heritage and remained devoutly Islamic, were supportive of the Mujahideen in their struggle against their communist overlords. This support, combined with the massive amount of Muslim recruits to the Great Jihad from the Arab world, served to create a creeping sense of futility among the Soviet troops. To drive the, quote, evil empire to the point of total collapse, the CIA continued to infuse the holy war with munitions and money until the war in Afghanistan became the agency's most expensive covert undertaking. Wow. That's the most, well, yeah. I would just think that all the heroin trafficking, I guess that is a profit. That's a net profit. So by 1985, the Afghan rebels were receiving $250 million a year in dirty money from the CIA to battle the 115,000 Soviet troops occupying the country. This figure was double the number of Soviet troops who had been deployed to Afghanistan in 1984. The annual payments to the Muslim guerrillas reached nearly $1 billion by 1988. By this time, the CIA was also shipping highly sophisticated weaponry, including Stinger missiles, to the jihadists, whom they mistakenly viewed as, quote, freedom fighters. I don't know if they even, I don't think there's any mistake about it. I think they just saw them as a useful, like they continue to do. It's just like a tool, yeah. And then I would recommend people check back on some of the previous reading hours where we read through, God, what was that called? The Peter Dale Scott book. It's like Drugs, Money, and Guns, I believe. But it was about exactly that drugs for weapons trade that the CIA had been engaged in for decades at this point, when it got to, like we're just describing through all of the Gladio book, but it really tied all of the 70s and 80s into the continuation of Gladio and that same model. All right, so the next section here is Muslim missionaries. In an effort to supply recruits to the jihad, the CIA once again focused its attention on America's black community. This development was understandable. The agency realized that millions of African Americans who felt disenfranchised by the system had converted to Islam, which they saw as, quote, the black man's religion. This movement, prompted by such black leaders as Timothy Drew or Noble Drew Ali, Elijah Poole or Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm Little or Malcolm X, had given rise to hundreds of mosques within America's inner cities. By 1980, CIA began to send hundreds of militant Muslim missionaries, all members of the radical Tablighi Jamaat, into American mosques to call on young black men to take up arms in the Holy War to liberate their Muslim brothers. Sheikh Mubarak Gilani, Gilani, one of the first of these missionaries to arrive, convinced scores of members of the Yasin Mosque in Brooklyn to head off to guerrilla training camps in Pakistan, with an offer of thousands in cash and the promise of 70 hours or 70 Uris in the seventh heaven if they were killed in action. The cash came from the CIA's coffers. Wild shit. I mean, I guess people have always said that like the CIA armed and funded the Mujahideen and then ended up trying to, then the U.S. ends up trying to fight them after 9/11 or whatever. But I guess people don't really take into account the domestic aspect of this, like the domestic recruiting that they were doing in mosques. It's wild. So the training camps, the next section here. Realizing it would be financially advantageous to train the new recruits on American soil, Sheikh Gilani, with the help of the CIA, set up paramilitary training camps in rural areas throughout the country, including Hancock, New York, Red House, Virginia, Commerce, Georgia, York, South Carolina, Dover, Tennessee, Buena Vista, Colorado, Macon, Georgia, Squaw Valley, California, Marion, Alabama, and Talahena, Oklahoma. By 1985, the international press began to report that an unspecified number of African American Muslims, all related to the camps set up by Gilani, had joined the ranks of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and that several had been killed in action. When questioned, several of the jihadis imported from America would testify that they were agents of the CIA. Wild shit. Sorry if I was losing focus a little bit there. I was just, blown away by how wild this is. This is crazy. I'm going to, I just wanted to bold this section here because it's just so wild. I have to highlight it for later. The Al-Qaeda cell is the next section here. To provide more support for the Mujahideen, the CIA used Abdullah Azam, Osama bin Laden's mentor, to set up a cell of Al-Qaeda within Masjid Al-Farouk on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. The cell, known as Al-Kifa Refugee Center, acted as a front for the transference of funds, weapons, and recruits to Afghanistan. Throughout the 1980s, this militant organization received over $2 million a year, and Masjid Al-Farouk became a very wealthy institution. During this time, Azam spent a great deal of time in Brooklyn. In a 1988 videotape, he can be seen and heard telling a large crowd of African Americans that, quote, blood and martyrdom are the only way to create a Muslim society. By 1992, Al-Farouk Mosque had become a haven for Arabian veterans from the Great Jihad in Afghanistan, who were granted special passports to enter the United States by the CIA. A feud erupted between the older African-American members of the mosque and the Arab newcomers, which resulted in the murder of Mustafa Shalabi, the fiery imam of the mosque, on March 1st, 1991. The crime has never been solved. Okay, so obviously it sounds like the young newcomer refugees from the jihad that were sponsored by the CIA, given special passports to be there, and obviously they were on their side. It sounds like they murdered the imam who was running the place, and that crime was for some reason never solved. Crazy. New CIA amigos. Actually, hold on. Let me see how much longer I got on this. Yeah, I'll do like 4 more minutes. So yeah, new CIA amigos. The soaring expenses for the covert war in Afghanistan, coupled with the ongoing need of support for the guerrilla units in Latin America and the secret armies in Western Europe, caused the CIA to forge new alliances. In 1980, the agency deployed Dewey Claridge, its top agent in Latin America, to establish ties with the Honduran drug lord Juan Mata Ballesteros, who operated the airline Setco. Setco agreed to transport narcotics to gangs north of the border and arms to a warehouse in Honduras that was operated by CIA operatives Oliver North and Richard Secord. The weapons were purchased by the agency's cut of the deal, which in one transaction amounted to $14 million. The CIA also made business arrangements with other drug lords, including Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the quote godfather of the Mexican drug business, whose ranch became a training ground for right-wing guerrilla armies, and Miguel Nazar Haro, the leader of the Guadalajara cartel, Mexico's most powerful narcotics network. Yeah. So imagine again the irony of like the U.S. saying that they want to wage war on Mexican drug cartels, because they are actually American-run operations. By 1990, more than 75% of all the cocaine entering the United States came through Mexico. Mexico also became a leading source of heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamines. The business was generating $50 billion a year. The CIA had found a source of funding to augment its ongoing heroin trade with the Turkish Babas and the Sicilian Mafia. The new alliance meant that the agency could launch operations even more ambitious than Gladio. Yeah. That is a great tie-in, a great way to explain just in one paragraph how the CIA just kept using this exact same literally a business model, and they just kept expanding it, and they made a fucking franchise. It's like a worldwide franchise of heroin trafficking, for weapons, and militant guerrilla operations. Last Gasp is the next section here. In 1988, as the first half of the Soviet contingent began its withdrawal from Afghanistan, Operation Gladio came to an end in Western Europe. The official figures of the undertaking in Italy from the Gladio Commission showed that 14,591 acts of violence with, quote, political motivation had occurred between January 1st, 1969 and December 31st, 1987. Through Gladio, 491 people had been killed and 1,181 injured or maimed. The figures were without parallel in Italian history. In 1988, the Italian Senate established the, quote, Parliamentary Commission of the Italian Senate for the Investigation of Terrorism in Italy, under Senator Libero Galtieri. The investigation proved to be a daunting task. Witnesses withheld testimony, documents were destroyed, and the commissioners were divided on how much to disclose to the public. The commission itself was made up of members from the competing political parties in Italy. With some from the Italian left and others from the Italian right, they were split on what exactly the historical truth in Italy was, and they disagreed on how many of their sensitive findings should be presented to the public. Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of political interests at hand there. A lot of people have different opinions on who's really at fault, of course. Not surprising. I'll do one more section here. Documents discovered. But Judge Felice Casson, a member of the commission, finally uncovered documents that revealed that a secret military strategy had been at work during the years of lead. This strategy, involving an underground army, had been drafted by government sources and implemented by a foreign agency with an abundance of money. In July 1990, Casson obtained the permission from Prime Minister Andreotti to access the archives of the headquarters of SIS-MI within Palazzo Braschi in Rome. Within the archives, the judge found top-secret documents that spoke of a covert operation named Gladio that had been created by U.S. intelligence to engage in unorthodox warfare throughout Italy. Casson realized at once that by unearthing this information, he had placed himself in grave danger, since every investigator who had stumbled upon Gladio had come to a violent end. Quote, from July until October 1990, Casson later recalled, I was the only one who knew something about Operation Gladio. This could have been unfortunate for me. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess he's one of the few that actually does live to tell this tale. So, all right, I'll bookmark this one here, and now I'm going to switch over to the Western Marxism book. Let's see. All right, so we last left off. Let's see. Sorry, let me check the chat. I forgot to check the chat all day yesterday. I felt bad afterwards because some people had sent some messages. All right, so continuing here with the Western Marxism book. The Soviet Union and the quote socialist camp also exerted a positive influence with regard to a population of colonial origin in the heart of the capitalist metropolis itself, African Americans. They were oppressed by a regime of terrorist white supremacy when the October Revolution broke out. But from then on, a new unrest spread among the blacks, and without being intimidated by the witch hunts, they declared, quote, if to fight for one's rights is to be Bolshevists, then we are Bolshevists, and let them make the most of it. To take a leap of 15 years into the most tragic period of Soviet history, the collectivization of agriculture, imposed mainly from above and from outside, led to the spread of the gulags on a large scale, and the Great Terror was looming on the horizon. But it is interesting to see how the country that emerged from the October Revolution continued to be perceived by African Americans. Thanks to the activity of the Communist Party of the United States, they are beginning to acquire something that the white supremacist regime had stubbornly denied them: a culture that goes far beyond the elementary education traditionally given to those who were destined to do servile work in the service of the master race. Now in the Communist Party schools in the northern United States or in Moscow schools, blacks devoted themselves to studying economics, politics, and world history. They also used these disciplines to understand why they had been dealt such a harsh fate in a country that considers itself the refuge of freedom. Among those who attended such schools, a profound change was taking place. Their quote insolence reprimanded by the regime of white supremacy is, in reality, their previously suppressed and downtrodden self-esteem. A black woman delegate at the International Congress of Women Against War and Fascism, held in Paris in 1934, was extremely impressed by the relations of equality and fraternity that emerged, regardless of the differences of language and race, in this initiative promoted by the communists. Quote, it was heaven on earth. Yeah, I mean, I would encourage anyone to, this like almost sounds like the next book I'm going to get to in the next 20 minutes, but it sounds like the Soviets expected it. But like hearing people talk so positively about the Soviet Union, about their cultural achievements, like their actual progressive just norms that they had. But I would encourage anybody to look up Paul Robeson's quote where he said, like, in the Soviet Union, I felt human for the first time. It's like they actually just had racial equality. And when people experienced that, they actually did like it, believe it or not. Sorry. Let's see. So those who managed to get to Moscow, observed a contemporary U.S. historian, quote, experienced a sense of freedom unheard of in the South. A black man fell in love with a white Soviet citizen and married her, although he could not take her with him even when he returned home, knowing full well what fate awaited those in the South who were guilty of miscegenation and racial, quote, degeneration. And yet, even where the regime of white supremacy raged, a new climate was spreading. The Soviet Union, and Stalin especially, were looked upon with hope as the, quote, new Lincoln, who this time would put a complete end to the enslavement of blacks, the oppression, the brutalization, the humiliation, the violence, and the lynchings that they were continuing to suffer. These hopes were not completely disappointed. Let us think of the times when an element of a regime of white supremacy comes to an end and the circumstances in which this happens. In December 1952, the U.S. Attorney General addressed a revealing letter to the Supreme Court, urging it to deal with the question of integration in the public schools. Quote, racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubt even among friendly nations as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. Washington, observes the U.S. historian who has reconstructed the story, ran the risk of alienating the, quote, colored races, not only in the East and the Third World, but in the very heart of the United States. Even there, communist propaganda met with considerable success in its attempt to win blacks to the, quote, revolutionary cause, making them lose, quote, faith in American institutions. Which is like literally the same shit they're saying now. They're saying that like all the propaganda online that actually points out how racist the U.S. is all Russian propaganda. Like it's all done by Russian bots. The U.S. doesn't actually have a racism problem. All those riots, they've been stoked by Russian bots. It's all Putin. There is no doubt that concern for the objective challenge posed by Stalin's USSR and the influence it exerted on the peoples in the colonies and of colonial origin played an essential role in this event. Thus, quote, Eastern Marxism, unlike much of the Western variety, understood how to illuminate the colonial barbarities of capitalism very well. This is not all. Remember that Lenin praised as, quote, excellent the formulation of Hegel's logic, according to which the universal must comprise itself in, quote, the wealth of the particular. True to this approach, personalities such as Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, Mao, and Castro never constructed a contradiction between patriotism and internationalism, but have always seen in the liberation struggle of oppressed nations an essential moment in the path of internationalism and universalism, of what Gramsci calls integral humanism. Not so, however, Western Marxism. I guess that's pointing at how like Western Marxism tends to leave out the national question. It's like the only people I ever see bring that up are uh, like weird like left comms or like doctrinaire Marxists who I don't know are just like opposing things that like most other Marxists are supporting. Uh, or they'll be like a lot of ACP people will bring up the national question, but like I've never seen anybody do it like in good faith. Is what I'm trying to say. On the one hand, think of Althusser in particular. The categories, quote, humanity, people, and nation were eyed with suspicion, as if they were a betrayal of the class struggle, an attitude of superstitious purism that forgets that the categories socialism, revolution, and working class can also be turned in a conservative and even a reactionary direction. The example of the National Socialist German Workers' Party of unfortunate memory may suffice here. Althusser's concern can be countered with a forceful statement by Mao. Quote, national struggle in the final analysis is a question of class struggle. On the other hand, think above all of Adorno, and today of Negri, the struggles for national liberation, which were placed in contradiction with internationalism and universalism, were reviled. It is no coincidence that the veterans of Western Marxism today are full of contempt for the efforts of countries such as China and Vietnam to consolidate their independence also in the economic field, in such a way that, as Deng Xiaoping declared, quote, a real contribution to humanity can also be made. Whether for one reason or another, because of a superficial conception of the class struggle or because of an abstract conception of the general, Western Marxism has mostly failed to grasp the unity of the universal and the particular. I don't know if that's just like a really like a philosophical way to point out the impotence and ineffectiveness of the Western version of Marxism. That is a common theme in this book. On the one hand, this adherence to an abstract and pure idea of the universal has prevented an adequate understanding of national liberation movements, which continue to develop even after the seizure of power. On the other hand, it has led to the fact that a fundamental cause of the crisis of the quote socialist camp could not be understood. The break between the USSR and Yugoslavia in 1948, then the Soviet invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the near wars or outright wars between the USSR and China, China and Vietnam and Cambodia, all this shows how difficult, although indispensable, it is to reconcile internationalism, the universal, with the observance of national interests, national identity, national feelings, the particular. The Communist Party of China has, in its best moments, alluded to this problem. Western Marxism has almost always stereotypically understood these conflicts as confrontations between Stalinist despotism and the spirit of freedom, between bureaucracy and masses, or between the revolutionary consequences of one or another opportunism or revisionism, or even more superficially, as proof that both fighting parties had nothing to do with, quote, authentic socialism and Marxism. Yeah, I do like that. I'm going to bold that one as well. After all, Western Marxism has enjoyed its remoteness from power, as if this were a particularly favorable situation or the only possible prerequisite for unfolding the critical potencies of Marxist theory. Another good one. Yeah, bars there. While the view can become more sober, the remoteness from power and contempt for power can also cloud the view. They can complicate the understanding of the great global conflicts, as well as favor an idealistic attitude and ultimately an escape from history. This is the only way to explain Bloch's thesis that the bourgeois revolution, quote, limited equality to the political. Even if we want to deal exclusively with the capitalist metropolis, it is a historically untenable claim. One need only point to discrimination against women and the right to vote. Taken as a whole, Western Marxism has involuntarily represented two fundamental figures of Hegelian philosophy over the years, insofar as it is satisfied with criticism and derives its raison d'etre from criticism without facing the problem of formulating viable alternatives and creating a historical bloc that represents an alternative to the ruling one. It illustrates the all-knowing nature of wanting to be. If it enjoys its remoteness from power as a condition of its own purity, it embodies the beautiful soul. Perhaps it is no coincidence that today there is a book that enjoys great popularity among the Western left. Its title invites us to, quote, change the world without taking power. Here, the self-dissolution of Western Marxism ends up departing from the train of politics and is settling in the land of religion. Damn. Oh, man. I like that, too. I have been saying that for a while. Like, it's basically just a religion. And, like, people in the West will judge whether you are or not a Marxist or a leftist or whatever term they want to apply to it by what you say you, quote, unquote, support. And by that, you, like with your thoughts. It's like there's no material action needed. There's no, you don't need to like they'll ask you if you support China or something, and that means like, do you say favorable things about them? And it's like, I mean, I've harped on this so many fucking times. Like, if people who've been following me or listening to me for a while, you'll be sick of hearing me say it. But it's like people don't understand what support means. Like, they are literally supporting the U.S. Their labor goes to the empire. They're living in the Death Star, as it were. You know, they're paying taxes to the fucking military-industrial complex that they say they don't support, and they want more free stuff from the government that they're calling fascist and imperialist, and then saying that they're neutral, saying that they're not for either Washington or Beijing, while they pay taxes to Washington, and then criticize Beijing from their comfortable position benefiting from imperialism. Like, it's all fucking nonsense, and then it's all basically a religion. Like, you're in the group if you say you're in the group, and if you agree with the other people who say that they're in the group, but you're not doing the fucking thing. And then they all compete with each other on this like personal, like, it's like, who's the most pious, who donates the most of their money, who self-sacrifices the most. It's like flagellating themselves like those fucking Opus Dei people, while they're getting nothing systemic done. Like, the system does not care one bit if you impoverish yourselves and the rest of the people go on to make their money and continue to fucking subjugate the world. Like, it does not matter. So I guess maybe we're to the end of this one. There's a notes section, and I'm at page 200 of 243. So I think we might just be at the end of the book. Yeah, I think we're kind of done with the Western Marxism book. So cool. Funny that they ended on that idea that Western Marxism is more of a religion than an ideology, or let alone a political practice. So, all right. Well, I guess that means that I'm 7 minutes short. So I'll just do the rest of the time, I guess, on the Soviets Expected It book. All right. So let's see. So I make this bigger. No, man. Sorry. Okay, so last left off again, talking about World War II, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The larger strategy of the war, implied in Stalin's analysis, was soon elaborated by military experts in all lands. The German army would naturally make the most of its initial advantages and would try to force a decision before winter, even by wasteful use of men and material. The Germans had an immediate preponderance both of seasoned troops and of war materials, which they might cease to have if they allowed the Red Army to gain experience and the Soviet armament factories to continue operations. Soviet strategy must be the exact opposite, to defend territory with as little wastage of men and material as possible, and to make the enemy pay dearly for every advance, and to retreat when necessary to preserve their armed forces intact. The chief of the Soviet press department, Lozovsky, told the correspondent that the Soviets would, of course, quote, abandon a city to save a living army. There were several times in the early part of the war when British strategists, judging from London, thought that the Red Army should have retreated sooner than it did. The first impression of the war seems to have made upon The first impression the war seems to have made upon the Germans was that the Red Army men fought with spectacular valor. They complained that the Soviet soldiers did not fight, quote, sensibly, but kept on even when surrounded and outnumbered. Quote, these fellows, said a Nazi war correspondent on the second morning of the war, quote, fight with the consistency of madness until they cannot move a limb. The Berlin correspondent of the New York Times noted, unlike that of any of the Germans' former opponents, Russian morale appears to be totally oblivious to tank and Stuka attacks, and the Russians seem to continue to fight, particularly while the dreaded dive bomber formations are assembling to break their resistance. This inability to throw panic into the Soviet ranks necessitated new and different tactics in Russia. Crazy. They're just too badass. They're just too hard. Wild. The Russians themselves did not make so high a claim as was conceded to them by their opponents. Marshal Timoshenko frankly told an interviewer that the first attacks of this terrible dive bombers had considerably worried his troops. Or of the terrible dive, sorry. They soon got used to it and even displayed amusement at some of the whistling and noise-producing devices with which Germans tried to make a, quote, psychological attack. The first stories of the Red Army valor reached the world from Berlin rather than from Moscow. A German soldier, for instance, told of an attack on a forester's cabin, which turned out to be a Russian machine gun nest. Several times the Germans thought that the nest was completely demolished. They shot into the house with field guns until it was in flames. But the Russian machine guns continued to spatter pitilessly. We encircled them and threw in flame from flamethrowers until the entire house was ablaze. Still, the daredevils would spring out of it, throw a bunch of hand grenades, and then slip in again. Finally, our artillery crushed the charred, blackened ruins to pieces. Not a single man escaped from that hell. Many similar tales were told by Germans to indicate that in taking forts, they had to blow them apart wall by wall and room by room, and that even when they thought they had destroyed everything living, they found wounded Red Army soldiers still fighting on. Crazy. Crazy stuff. Yeah, and it's wild that like they hear, the rest of the world hears of all these tales of brave Russian soldiers from the Germans talking about how scared they are. To the world's military experts, the first surprise of the war was the Red Army's excellent equipment and technique. The Air Force, tank arm, and artillery proved surprisingly up to date. Observers reported tremendous tank battles in which, quote, the clash of steel against steel sounded like the end of the world. In these battles, it was noted that Russian tanks could often smash or overturn the Germans in head-on collision. The Red Army had several types of tanks which the Wehrmacht lacked. High-speed tanks, amphibians, and, quote, giants of 100 tons or more. Not only the equipment of the Red Army, but its staff work and strategy showed complete mastery of the complex processes of modern war. It is an army, quote, it is an army modern in structure, tactically efficient, and strategically realistic, said one expert. Another analyzed the Russian tactical methods as including defensive positions of great depth, stoutly held everywhere, camouflage of remarkable skill, protecting Russian artillery from German air attack, mobile counterattack units against German panzer columns, and an air force which fully supports the ground troops. I mean, that sounds like the ideal army that you would want to have. Like, it sounds like you got all your cylinders firing. As the war progressed, military observers even declared that the Russians, quote, had solved the blitzkrieg by the tactics of permitting a breakthrough of the panzer columns and then cutting them off from their supporting infantry. Quote, infantry is the weak spot in the German army, claimed a Soviet war correspondent. Quote, it is accustomed to move behind great masses of tanks. When isolated, it loses and its losses are enormous. The tactics with which the Red Army opposed the blitzkrieg demanded tremendous morale and initiative. Tremendous bodies of Soviet troops were left far behind the German spearheads and were sometimes even encircled by the enemy. According to previous military theory, they were, quote, entrapped. These Red Army forces fought their way across and through the German encirclement, disrupted German communications, and in the last resort were capable of splitting up into small units and rallying the local population around them to form guerrilla bands. Sorry, I have hiccups. It almost seemed as if they had been left behind on purpose. If not, they showed surprising initiative in meeting conditions. The amazing tale of one of these lost divisions, which finally fought its way back to the main lines of the Red Army after more than a month in western Byelorussia, shows the chaotic condition of the German rear. The division lost contact with its higher command during the first German offensive into Byelorussia. Several hours later, German planes circled overhead and dropped a map showing that the division was encircled and should surrender. "Thank you for giving us our bearings," the commander remarked, glancing at the enemy planes. Taking advantage of the map, he evaded the enemy troops and turned east toward the main Red Army lines. During the ensuing month of fighting, the division exhausted its ammunition but captured and used German supplies. It became necessary on one occasion to have exact information of the enemy strength. An exceedingly short officer, less than 5 feet tall, went to a village, donned children's clothes, and gathered a group of Russian children. They wandered to the bank of a stream where German officers were bathing, and the captain stole maps and documents from the officers' clothes until under cover of the children's play. Another time, the division reached an important highway along which German motor transport was moving at a fast rate. Waiting till dusk, the Russians killed the German traffic officer, and held up the enemy automobiles with flashlight signals while the division crossed the road. Then a Russian soldier in the slain man's uniform deliberately misdirected the Nazi tank columns along the wrong route. Quote, "For the first time," said a New York Times editorial, quote, "Hitler is fighting in a new dimension." This is wild stuff. This is like stuff out of a movie. Like that whole last wild. Yeah, I want to highlight that one too. I've started trying to like highlight some of these things in the hopes that I'll go back, remember to like screenshot them for posting on other social media, and then I almost never do. But if anybody watching these wants to, go for it. You'll probably get some likes. Quote, "For the first time," said a New York Times editorial, "Hitler is fighting in a new dimension. It is doubtful if the writer realized the full truth of his words." He was speaking of the geography, but the Red Army had created a, quote, "defense in depth that transcends geography and reaches into the whole consciousness of the Soviet people. The war has become a, quote, total defense, a war of the entire Soviet people as a unit. It is the first time in history that such a total defense has been seen, the first time that it has become possible. It is possible in the USSR because the whole population rallies around a country whose wealth they all share, and because the Soviet people and the Red Army have grown accustomed to joint activities for 2 decades. Despite the picturesque tales of guerrillas that have found their way into the American and British press, it is doubtful whether the essence of Soviet guerrilla war is yet understood by the Anglo-American experts. They are accustomed to think in terms of the wars of Europe, where the army does the fighting, while the civilians make their peace with the invader. At most, the experts think of guerrilla war as an affair of pitchforks and shotguns that are seized by a desperate population after the regular army has gone. In Soviet tactics, there is no break between the activities of the army and those of the people. They fit into each other flexibly at all times, before, during, and after the regular army's retreat. The collective farm, as we have seen in an earlier chapter, fits in admirably to the military organization. It already has its defense group, its labor battalions, its organization for caring for children and the weak. If the farm is in the immediate rear of the Red Army, his activities are those typified in the Ukrainian village K. Through its formerly quiet streets roll endless truckloads of fuel and ammunition bound for the front. In case of need, the collective farm's machine shop offers minor repairs. Many of the farmers are now in the army and are replaced by women. The remainder have rapidly harvested the crops and threshed more than half of them, taking them to the railroad for transport to the rear. During a brief lull on the front, 50 Red Army men came to assist in the reaping and threshing. They accounted for 50 acres of peas and 40 acres of wheat before they had to go back to fight. Some 40 of the farmers are working full-time repairing roads for the army. Gangs of girls and women under the direction of army choppers dig trenches and camouflage them with foliage. This organized dovetailing of the activities of the army and people continues without a break if the army is forced to retreat. Some of the civilians retreat with it as labor gangs. They destroy the village completely before they go. A detailed account of this, quote, total destruction was given by a village designated only as X. When the Germans approached, a group of young people entered the granary, loaded 9 trucks, and sent them to the railway station camouflaged under green boughs. 4 tons of barley and vetch, which could not be removed, were burned. The tractors plowed down and uprooted the beets. The milkmaids drove the cows through the maturing wheat and rye. They were followed by 80 girls and women with sickles and scythes, sickles and scythes who chopped what was left. The mechanics broke the fuel tank. The blacksmiths destroyed the harvesters and thresher. The broken machinery was thrown down a steep precipice. The people burned the pigsty, cowsheds, granary, beehives, and the new stable. The best horses were driven to the forest for the use of guerrillas. That's cool. 14 fattened pigs were slaughtered for the Red Army commissary. The rest were driven to the railroad and shipped to the rear. The wells were filled with earth, and the water from the pond was let out by breaking the dike. Even the green apples were picked by the gardener with the remark, quote, "They shall not ripen for the robbers." Hilarious. That's what do you call it? It's like uh, it's very fastidious. It's like very detailed. If possible, the entire population of the village scatters in an organized manner. If there is time, the children and weaker adults are evacuated by train to the interior of the country. A fortnight after the war began, trains of evacuated people began arriving in Sverdlovsk and other towns of the Urals, where jobs or accommodations in rest homes were at once available for the newcomers, a fate quite different from that which befell the refugees of Western Europe. The most able bodied of the population go into hiding in the woods as a guerrilla organization that harries the enemy's rear under direct orders from the Red Army and often in coordination with the fighting at the front. Leadership and equipment for these guerrillas are supplied partly from their local Osovoakim group, which, even in peacetime, often possessed rifles, machine guns, anti tank guns, mine throwers, flamethrowers, and other modern weapons of war. These are supplemented by sections of the regular Red Army that have, quote, disintegrated under German attack. Any section of the Red Army that is surrounded fights on a circular front as long as it can afford to do so, and then scatters over the countryside to furnish both leadership and equipment to the guerrillas. Thus there comes into being a kind of guerrilla organization such as has never been seen before. It consists of all types of troops, infantry, artillery, engineers, cavalry. They try to avoid fighting large units of the enemy. They, quote, specialize in attacking headquarters, railroads, bridges, military trains, and stray German generals. As a sideline, they take care of any local, quote, quislings that may emerge, thus making it impossible for the Germans to stabilize the rear. The guerrillas communicate with the Red Army by two-way radio or by planes sent from headquarters. Some of them have even their own planes. From the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, these guerrillas materialize wherever there are German troops. From ambush, strike in the night, and vanish, leaving the Germans to count their dead. A favorite tactic is to cut the German telephone and telegraph wires and ambush the technicians sent to repair them. For weeks at a time, German communications in some areas have been interrupted. Another tactic is to sow the roads with steel pikes in order to damage tires. This is especially effective on narrow forest trails used by motorcycle messengers, which when they dismount to repair the tires, they are killed from ambush. Which I guess then you get the bike too. Any new ideas developed by any guerrillas are rapidly spread by guerrilla newspapers, which circulate in the occupied area. Quote, "You can't stop the wind in the fields," say the local farmers of the, quote, grandfathers detachment, a band which has already won renown. One of its exploits was the clever capture of 8 German tanks. A 16-year-old boy brought the information that the tanks had halted in a certain gully. Cautious investigation showed that they had run out of gasoline. The guerrillas formed 3 groups: riflemen, gasoline throwers, and tractor drivers. They located themselves at strategic spots. On a signal, the gasoline throwers hurled 30 bottles of gasoline at the 4 tanks, which went up in flame. 12 Germans jumped out of the other 4 tanks and were shot by the riflemen. The 4 tanks that were captured intact were promptly driven away by the tractor drivers. "We are camped in a virgin forest," wrote one guerrilla commander. "Only the people who guard our supplies stay in camp. The rest are always on the march. The population of the occupied villages loves us like a mother and keeps us informed of the enemy's movements. The Nazis worry themselves to death hunting us." Not all these irregular fighters are in the woods. Some of them are in cities. In one Russian city, the civilians broke a siege after German tanks had reached the outskirts and encircled the town. Men and women poured out of the factories and offices, went to the front lines, dug fortifications, and held off the German attacks until they were relieved by the Red Army. The carrying of information to the Red Army by civilians has been a valuable aid. The Merkulov brothers in the Smolensk district brought such accurate data on the location of several machine gun nests and an airfield used by the German bombers that Soviet long-range guns destroyed the field and the nests by night firing. On the Odessa front, a 15-year-old girl went by night to the leader of a guerrilla detachment and told him that Romanian troops had arrived in her village and were quartered in a schoolhouse. That same night, the guerrillas tossed grenades into the school, killed 20 Romanians, and captured motorcycles and other equipment. Also, I guess the Romanians were on the side of, or maybe had been press ganged into working for the Nazis. Oh, sorry. So the Germans testify with considerable exasperation to the effectiveness of the guerrillas. One typical report said, quote, "For a fortnight we were busy hunting guerrillas. Planes flew over the district. Several detachments under the command of experienced officers combed all the surrounding forests, hills, and gullies, but did not discover any guerrilla detachments. However, subversive acts and mysterious murders are becoming more frequent. In the last 10 days, they killed 2 lieutenants, 2 non-commissioned officers, and 20 privates. They caused 11 fires, the most important being a fire at the oil depot, at the provisions depot, at a flour mill, a wooden bridge, and an ammunition dump. No single culprit has been discovered." Based. Hell yeah, these guys are great at what they're doing. "It is not difficult to imagine the weariness of carrying on war in a country where the village that was to afford relief is found to be a smoking heap of ashes, and where the sudden shock of unexpected combat keeps the nerves forever tense. The Germans retaliate with a policy of frightfulness which is generally conceded to be more ferocious than anything they have hitherto done in the war in Europe or in Gestapo concentration camps. Prime Minister Churchill speaks of the, quote, indescribable atrocities. Many are unprintable in nature. Details are naturally hard to check, but the machine gunning of civilians in large groups seems to be a common occurrence, and so is the use of torture to get information about guerrilla bands. Cases are alleged of the gouging out of the eyes of wounded, the torture of children in the presence of their mothers, the pulling of men and women to pieces by tying them to tanks. In a village near Bialystok, an eyewitness reported having seen the bodies of 5 women impaled, naked on sharpened stakes with stomachs cut open and heads lying nearby in a pool of blood among the bodies of slaughtered children. They were families of Red Army commanders. Alexei Tolstoy, the well-known writer, has appealed for an international commission to receive the evidence which he possesses. Threats and torture do not seem to locate the guerrillas. In the village Nikitina near Smolensk, former Voronin, uh, the aged farmer Voronin was tortured to death by the German Lieutenant Mittel for refusing to reveal the whereabouts of a guerrilla band containing his 3 sons. During the next few days, the Voronin brothers killed 7 Germans and finally succeeded in shooting Lieutenant Mittel. They chalked on the house where his body was the words, quote, "For our father and for outrages against the Soviet people." Threats and torture sometimes drive to flight whatever population remained. In the occupied town of Timkovichi, an order was posted by the German commander warning the population that for every German killed, quote, "the first 10 Russians we come across will be immediately shot, irrespective of sex or age." The first night after the order was posted, all the town's residents disappeared into the woods. Moscow, as befitted the Red Capital, took the war in its stride. Rationing of food was accepted as a natural way of handling the situation. Shop windows were covered with crisscross blue and black ribbons to prevent shattering during air bombing. Much of this taping was done in artistic designs. The streets were full of soldiers, and the city was sandbagged and camouflaged to the utmost, but there were neither demonstrations nor parades. Traffic remained normal. Telephone, lights, and water system functioned. Operas and concerts went on. The activities of sport continued, but acquired a grimmer note. A competition in throwing bundles of 5 hand grenades attracted considerable interest. German planes brought down near Moscow were exhibited to large crowds in the various parks. The best seller among children's books was a volume showing how to recognize various models of airplanes so that the children could tell a German from a Soviet plane by its silhouette against the sky. Far up in the pale blue August sky, the Soviet air patrols passed back and forth, too high to be seen, but giving by the measured drone of their motors a new undertone to the rhythm of Moscow life. After dark, the city became an ink spot lit only by the moon. At night, the Moscow subway, pride of the whole country, ceased normal operations and received tens of thousands of citizens into its marble halls for shelter against air raids. At night, young men in their teens, too young to be off to the front, eagerly sought posts on the house roofs from which to hurl down incendiary bombs. One who had the luck to get 20 bombs in one night received a medal. Wow, they would hurl down bombs at who though? I guess like invading Germans. Wow. A British Yeah, his name was in the papers the following day. A British air defense expert who went to Moscow to transmit the benefit of London experience uh, returned to Britain, remarking that Moscow was very much better defended than London, and that, quote, to teach the Russians air defense was like teaching the New York Yankees baseball. Everybody is impressed by Moscow. Erskine Caldwell tells how the labor squads of the, quote, People's Army appear like magic wherever there is a bombed building to be dug into. He adds, quote, you hear a lot of singing as the detachments march, whether it is a detachment of soldiers, sailors, fire wardens, or a People's Army labor squad. Ralph Ingersoll cables, quote, the morale is not simply good, it is spectacular, cocky, confident, neither underestimating nor overestimating the enemy's strength. The continued public admission of unfavorable news is highly significant. Moscow is the calmest war capital I have visited. All over the Soviet land in the rear of the Red Army war industry has speeded up to help the front. People passing through the Caucasus or through Siberia said that the characteristic they chiefly noticed was the heightened tempo of work. Despite the departure of many farmers to the front, the harvest everywhere has been reaped in record time and transported to safe places. A geographic regrouping of essential petroleum production was carried out so that all important petroleum products, including high-test gasoline, are manufactured simultaneously in several different places. Far out in the Kuznets coal basin, coal production reached a level never known in the basin's history. In some mines, the daily output per miner went up as much as 30% in the first 6 weeks of war. Magnitogorsk iron miners extracted scores of thousands of tons of ore, quote, above the plan. Ore output increased nearly 50% in 2 months. When the first shipment of American fighter planes arrived in Moscow, it was found that the assembly tools would not arrive till the following boat in a fortnight. At once, a squad of Russian engineers inspected the planes, decided what tools were needed to assemble them, devoted an entire factory to making the tools, and got the planes into the sky within 4 days. That's crazy. Messages from the Red Army to the war industries helped stimulate production. The pilots of one unit of the Air Force wrote to the Frunze factory saying, quote, we have tested your machines in action and appreciate their high quality. We have wiped out and will continue to wipe out the Nazi vultures with aircraft driven by your engines. The Soviet press features incidents of increased productivity and thus multiplies them. What now? It features incidents of increased productivity. Oh, and thus multiplies them, I guess, by publishing them and getting other people, by motivating others. Not that they're fictitiously exaggerating them. That's how I first thought of it. In the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, a tool shop worker introduced a method of rationalization that cut the time needed for an important operation to 1/24th. In the Tambov railway car repair shops, 2 men designed a riveting press that multiplied the labor productivity of all the riveters in the shops 800%. Okay, so they're sharing the knowledge. They're not like, these are not competing businesses in different areas of the country. It's just because it's collective, they can just share their innovation. In an automobile plant at Stalinabad in faraway Central Asia, a native Uzbek mechanic speeded output. They have Stalinabad. That's cool. I just was taken aback by that for a second. In faraway Central Asia, a native Uzbek mechanic speeded output 9-fold by mechanizing an operation formerly performed by hand. Far out in Siberia, a foreman in a machine shop invented an automatic regulator for a lathe that increased labor productivity 29 times. All these workers were featured by name for their contributions to the defense of the defense of the country. Yeah, I mean, people should also look up Stakhanovites. That's something that people have been talking about for a while. Like, contrary to the common Western belief that under communism everyone is paid the same, so there's no motivation to work harder or innovate or do anything like that. It's actually not the case. Stakhanovites were recognized for their extra hard work and rewarded proportionally. Not to mention the dozens of examples of right here of just even just this last couple paragraphs of people being recognized and rewarded for their contributions. So defense funds sprang up spontaneously all over the land, workers giving 1 or 2 days earnings per month for the duration, farms giving thousands of tons of grain, butter, and meat. At the Blood Transfusion Institute in Moscow, a long line of people stood offering their blood for wounded men. A group of boys from the trade schools was indignant because their blood was rejected on the ground that they were not yet 18. Quote, "We are not taken for the front either," complained one of the boys. "What are we then to give?" Yeah. Yeah, everybody had just like a national sense of pride and actually wanted to contribute to the war effort. Imagine that. Imagine actually fighting a just war against the Nazis. So, all right, guys, so I'm going to bookmark this one here. So, yeah, again, I finished up the Western Marxism book. If you guys want to check that one out, again, the links are in there. But I'll take suggestions in the chat, in the Discord. You can email truecrimesoftheempire@gmail.com for suggestions for what book I should pick up on the next time I do one. So, need a third book. In case you haven't been keeping up or just checking in, I just read 3 books for 20 minutes apiece, and that's the reading hour. But yeah, give me suggestions for one to replace the Western Marxism book. But I thought that was a good one. I really liked it. I think the guy Losurdo and Rockhill translating it, they like aptly diagnosed Western Marxism. They nailed it. They pointed out that it is a fucking religion and it's a club more than any kind of practice or ideology. It's not serious.